He was the silent storm of Hollywood, the man who turned Fast and Furious, Triple X, and Pitch Black into more than movies, into myths about loyalty, loss, and drive. But behind the roar of engines was a boy born with nothing, no father's name, no safety net, just the echo of a mother's voice in a city that didn't care. In the rough streets of New York, he was told he didn't fit anywhere. Too light to be black, too dark to be white. Hollywood didn't know where to place him, so he built his own place. From a nightclub bouncer to one of the most recognizable faces on earth, Vin Diesel carried his pain the way others carried fame. Now at 58, he is proof that strength isn't the absence of scars. It's the will to keep moving when every part of you wants to stop. Because even the strongest engine can break and still find a way to run. July 18th, 1967, in Alameda County, California, a baby entered the world with a name, but not a father. On the birth certificate of Mark Sinclair, the line for father was left empty, a silent question that would follow him for life. His mother, Delora Vincent, was an actress and astrologer, a woman who looked to the stars for meaning when the world gave her none. She dreamed boldly, but reality was relentless. Every bill, every late night, every unanswered prayer carved strength into her voice. That missing name didn't just mark a man he never met. It marked the start of a journey built on uncertainty. A childhood born not from comfort, but from the constant search for where he truly belonged. When Mark was 3, his mother met Irving H. Vincent, a calm, patient theater teacher from Harlem who saw promise where others saw trouble. He took in both twins, Mark and his brother Paul, and became the only father they would ever truly know. The family packed their few belongings and moved into West Beth Artist Housing in New York City, a crumbling building filled with dreamers who could barely afford to dream. The elevators were broken more often than they worked. Winters came without heat, and the walls carried the smell of paint, smoke, and hope that never paid rent. It wasn't luxury, it was survival wrapped in imagination, as Vin would later say. It was tough, but it saved us. Nights in that tiny apartment were cold and quiet. When dinner ran out, his mother would lift her eyes to the sky and tell her children stories about the stars, so they would forget how empty their stomachs felt. His stepfather filled those same walls with voices of forgotten kids, teaching acting to children who couldn't afford lessons. The rooms were cracked and dim, but they were alive with words, laughter, and hope painted over despair. For Mark, imagination wasn't a game, it was survival. They didn't dream because life was easy. They dreamed because it was the only way to stay alive. As he grew older, the mirror became both his teacher and his enemy. Each reflection seemed to ask a question he couldn't answer. Too light to be called black, too dark to be called white. He lived in the space between labels. Years later, he would describe it with a half-smile hiding pain. My identity was like Schrodinger's cat, neither one thing nor another until someone decided to open the box. At 7 years old, curiosity and hunger led Mark and a few neighborhood kids to break into a small theater in Greenwich Village. They weren't chasing dreams, just trouble and a warm place to hide. Instead of police sirens, the stage lights came on. Standing there was Crystal Field, the theater's director. She didn't yell. She didn't call the cops. She handed each child a script and $20. "Come back tomorrow," she said, "and earn it on stage." That single act of kindness changed everything. From that night forward, Mark Sinclair never left the theater. He had found the one place in the world where silence could finally turn into a voice. By the time Mark Sinclair turned 18, he was already running on fumes. He had dreams of literature at Hunter College, but textbooks didn't fill empty stomachs. So he walked out of the classroom one gray afternoon and into a life that paid in bruises instead of grades. By day, he sold light bulbs over the phone from a dusty office, repeating the same pitch until his throat went dry. The pay barely covered rent in rooms where the heat broke more often than it worked, and the smell of old rain clung to the walls. At night, he changed uniforms from a salesman's smile to a bouncer's stare. Clubs like Tunnel, Mars, and limelight were his battlegrounds. Neon jungles pulsing with strobe lights, cigarette smoke, and music that never stopped pounding. He learned fast that the door was a war zone. Every drunk man was a test. Every fight a reminder that strength had a price. He once joked, half serious, "I got into 500 fights a year." It wasn't pride. It was proof he survived another shift. Sometimes the blood on his knuckles was his own. Sometimes it wasn't. He'd walk home through freezing streets before sunrise, hands aching, pockets nearly empty, his reflection in store windows looking more stranger than man. For 10 years, he guarded doors that would never open for him. But in that decade of noise and violence, something harder than muscle was being built: discipline. He was learning how to keep standing when every door slammed shut, how to turn pain into patience and exhaustion into purpose. It wasn't a glamorous life. It was survival in its rawest form, a long, bruised rehearsal for the battles that would one day make him Vin Diesel. After a decade of rejection, Mark grew tired of waiting for permission to exist. Every casting room felt the same polite smile, the same quiet judgment behind the words, "You don't quite fit." Too light for one role, too dark for another. Hollywood didn't know what box to put him in, so he decided to build his own box. With just $3,000 borrowed dollars, he bought a second-hand camera, borrowed lights, and turned a tiny apartment into a film set. For 3 sleepless days, he wrote, directed, acted, and even composed the score. The short film was called Multifacial, a story about an actor who never fits the part, mirroring the truth he had lived his whole life. When it was finished, he was broke again, but the reel carried something money couldn't buy: honesty. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that truth would open doors that every rejection had once slammed shut. In 1990, that little homemade film, Multifacial, made its way to the Cannes Film Festival. Mark arrived with no tuxedo, no agent, and no expectations. He didn't walk the red carpet. He walked the sidewalk outside, watching his own dream flicker on a French movie screen. Somewhere in that crowd sat a man who would change everything: Steven Spielberg. The legendary director saw in that short film what Hollywood had missed: authenticity, hunger, and truth. A few months later, a phone call came that would rewrite Mark's life. Spielberg had written a part specifically for him in Saving Private Ryan. The boy who once guarded doors in New York was about to step onto a battlefield in France and into the heart of Hollywood itself. That call from Spielberg in 1998 changed everything. Mark Sinclair, the bouncer from New York, was suddenly standing beside Tom Hanks on the set of Saving Private Ryan. Under the smoke of fake gunfire and rain machines, he poured every ounce of rejection and hunger into that performance. It wasn't just acting, it was release. Hollywood noticed. Within 2 years, the man who once begged for auditions became the face of a new generation of action heroes. In 2000, Pitch Black introduced him as Riddick, a brutal survivor who saw in the dark, much like the man who played him. Then came The Fast and the Furious in 2001, made for just $38 million, but exploding past $270 million worldwide. By 2002, XXX cemented him as an icon, a storm of steel, loyalty, and adrenaline. The boy without a father had become his own legend, and the name Mark Sinclair quietly faded, replaced forever by the one the world now knew: Vin Diesel. In 2004, Vin Diesel chased a dream bigger than any studio plan. He poured his heart, his money, and his pride into the Chronicles of Riddick, a 120 million vision he believed would define his career. But when the lights dimmed and the box office numbers came in, the film collapsed under its own weight. Critics were harsh, audiences stayed away, and the same doors that had once opened for him began to close again. "It broke me," he admitted years later. Not just the movie, the silence that followed it. The phone stopped ringing, and for the first time since he'd made it, Vin Diesel found himself alone with doubt instead of applause. Out of the failure came focus. Vin Diesel returned to the world that had first believed in him: Fast and Furious. But this time, he wasn't just its star. He became its architect, rewriting scripts, producing laying, and shaping every scene into something deeper than cars and chaos. The gamble worked. In 2011, Fast Five roared across the globe, earning $626 million and reviving a franchise everyone thought had run out of road. Vin had rebuilt both his career and his identity, turning speed into symbolism, a story about loyalty, family, and endurance. Then, in 2013, tragedy struck like a crash no one saw coming. Paul Walker, his brother on and off screen, was gone. Production stopped. The set fell silent. Vin locked himself away for weeks before returning, voice trembling, to finish what they had started. When Furious 7 hit theaters in 2015, it became one of the highest-grossing films in history, $1.5 billion worldwide. Audiences cheered, but Vin sat in silence, watching the final scene, two cars, two brothers, parting at sunset. It wasn't acting, he said later. It was goodbye. It was 2001, on the roaring set of The Fast and the Furious. Engines thundered, smoke curled through the air, and two young actors found something real in a story built on fiction. Vin Diesel was quiet, grounded, and guarded. Michelle Rodriguez was fire, raw, fearless, and untamed. The chemistry between them didn't need a script. It lived in the way they looked at each other when the director yelled, "Cut!" Off camera, they stayed behind long after the crew had gone. Two souls caught somewhere between movie magic and something that felt achingly real. He'd walk her to her car, still smelling of motor oil and adrenaline. And for a moment, the world outside the set disappeared. They weren't Vin and Michelle then, they were just two people who had both spent too long pretending to be stronger than they felt. She made him laugh, loud and unguarded, something the world rarely saw from him. He made her feel safe, not with words, but with presence. There was a kind of calm in his silence that she understood. Their love was never loud. There were no magazine covers or red carpet confessions, just breakfasts before sunrise, coffee cups beside open scripts, and quiet drives through Los Angeles when the streets were empty. But Hollywood doesn't sleep, and love, under those lights, rarely survives. As the franchise grew, the world began to close in. Interviews, schedules, flights, endless nights on opposite sides of the planet. What began as peace slowly turned into distance. No fights, no drama, just time and noise pulling two people apart. He buried himself in work. She chased her own storms. By the time the cameras rolled again, their story had already ended quietly, like a car that ran out of fuel on an empty highway. Years later, when asked about her, Vin smiled, a small, private smile that belonged to memory, not regret. Michelle was part of the beginning, he said softly. You never forget the people who were there when the world first started noticing you. It wasn't a tragic ending, just a human one. Two actors, two hearts, meeting at the exact right moment in life, and letting go when fame made the world too loud for love to last. In 2002, far from the flashing cameras of Los Angeles, Vin found something he never thought possible: peace. He was filming in Prague, a city of cobblestones, gray skies, and quiet mornings, when he met Pavla Herbova, a young Czech model with calm eyes and a voice that carried no judgment, no expectations. She didn't care about red carpets or premieres. She cared about mornings, the simple kind, with sunlight spilling through the kitchen window and the smell of coffee in the air. With her, Vin wasn't Vin Diesel, the star. He was Mark, the man behind the armor. For 2 years, their lives moved at a slower rhythm. They cooked together, walked along the Vltava River, and spent nights talking about everything fame never allowed him to say. She called him gentle, not famous. He called her home. For the first time, he believed he could have both, love and peace. So one winter morning, he asked her to stay forever. A ring, a promise, a quiet hope that maybe this time the road wouldn't end. But Pavla only smiled, kissed his hand, and whispered, "No, you deserve the world," she said softly. but I can't live in it. He didn't beg. He didn't argue. He just nodded, the way men do when their hearts understand what their words can't fix. For weeks after she left, he kept her cup on the counter, her book by the bed, as if she might walk back through the door. She never did. When Pavla said goodbye, she left behind a letter, handwritten, folded neatly, tucked inside a book of poetry. It read, "Thank you for showing me love in a world that moves too fast." He kept that letter for years, tucked inside the drawer of his trailer on set. Sometimes, between takes, he would open it, read those words again, and let the silence settle where she once was. It wasn't a breakup, it was a gentle ending, a reminder that even the strongest man needs stillness, and that sometimes the right person is the one who teaches you how to let go without breaking. It was 2007, and Vin Diesel was at the height of his fame, an international action star who could command entire box offices with a glance. But inside, he was exhausted. Years of filming, traveling, pretending to be indestructible had left him hollow. He had fortune, fans, and fame, but not peace. Then somewhere between chaos and calm, he met Paloma Jimenez. She was a 23-year-old model from Mexico, graceful and grounded, a woman whose silence spoke louder than any applause. She didn't see the movie star. She saw the man underneath, Mark Sinclair. And for the first time in decades, he stopped running. They built something Hollywood rarely recognizes: simplicity, mornings instead of premieres, walks instead of parties, laughter that didn't need cameras. She brought him back to the real world, the one where breakfast means more than box office numbers. While filming The Pacifier, Vin realized something had shifted inside him. "I wanted to be a father," he said later, "but I needed to become the kind of man who deserved to be one." With Paloma, he found that chance. A year later, in April 2008, their first child was born, Hania Riley. He was on set when Paul Walker noticed something in his eyes and asked, "What's on your mind, brother?" Vin told him the truth. He was terrified of missing the birth. Paul smiled and said, "Go, cut the cord yourself. It'll change your life." He did. In that moment, shaking with fear and joy, changed everything. 2 years later came their son, Vincent, and in 2015, another daughter, Pauline, named after the brother he lost but never stopped carrying with him. "Every time I look at her," he said softly, "I see Paul smiling." But even fairy tales crack under the weight of fame. While the world saw premieres and record-breaking films, Paloma saw empty chairs at the dinner table, nights when he came home long after the kids had fallen asleep. Sometimes the silence between them was peaceful, and sometimes it felt heavy, filled with the pist of being the man everyone wanted. There were disagreements, quiet ones, never public, never loud, about time, about distance, about the world that always demanded more of him. Yet no matter how far the films took him, he made one rule that no studio could break: no filming on his children's birthdays. He told every producer the same thing, and family isn't part of the franchise. It's the reason the franchise exists. That promise became sacred. Nearly 2 decades later, Vin and Paloma have never signed marriage papers, but their bond has lasted longer than most vows in Hollywood. She avoids interviews, rarely walks red carpets, and chooses to raise their 3 children quietly, far from the flash of cameras. He still calls her his Mayan queen, a title whispered, never performed. Their love isn't a spectacle, it's human, a balance between noise and calm, duty and devotion. When he talks about her now, his voice lowers, his words slow. "When I became a father, I stopped running." Peace isn't found in applause. It's in the little hands that hold you when the world gets loud. And in that truth, the man who once chased glory at full speed finally found his finish line, not in the fast lane, but at home, surrounded by the family he built from the silence of his past. It was November 30th, 2013, a quiet Saturday in Santa Clarita, California. The world looked ordinary until it wasn't. A phone call shattered everything. Paul Walker, Vin Diesel's brother in life and on screen, was gone. No warning, no goodbye. He had just left a charity event for typhoon victims in the Philippines, riding in a Porsche Carrera GT with his friend Roger Rodas. One turn, one flash, a light pole, a tree, and in seconds, the world lost them both. They had been helping others when fate decided it had helped enough. When the news broke, the city stood still. Fans gathered outside studio gates with flowers, candles, and model cars. Hundreds of tiny flames trembled against the night wind. But inside his car, Vin drove through Los Angeles in silence. Headlights dimmed, whispering to himself, "It can't be real." But it was, and it broke something deep inside him. They had met more than a decade earlier, two men from different worlds who found family in each other. Vin was thunder, intense, guarded, commanding. Paul was calm seas, gentle, smiling, always grounding everyone around him. Between takes, they'd sit on the hood of a Charger, talking about their kids, their faith, their families, the kind of conversations that never make it into a script. "He taught me to slow down," Vin once said quietly. "He was the better man." When the funeral came, it wasn't a Hollywood spectacle. It was private, raw, wrapped in prayer. Hundreds stood outside the gates in tears. But inside, Vin stayed to the back, head bowed, hands trembling as the first shovel of earth fell. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Afterward, Paul's mother took his hand and whispered through tears, "You lost your other half." Those words carved themselves into his soul. The weeks that followed were a blur. He would drive aimlessly through the city at night, windows down, no music, just the hum of the engine. He couldn't act, couldn't smile. "The cameras were rolling," he said later, "but I wasn't there." When his youngest daughter was born in 2015, he named her Pauline, not for the memory, but for the promise that memory carried. "I felt him there in the delivery room," Vin said. "It was the first time I could smile again." Every year since, when the calendar reaches November 30th, everything stops. No filming, no interviews, no engines. The crew knows that day belongs to Paul. On every Fast and Furious set, there's a single empty chair. No one sits in it. No one moves it. Beside it lies a folded jacket and a framed photograph, two brothers smiling under sunlight that no longer exists. Vin never let Paul's family fade into silence either. He became godfather to Paul's daughter, Meadow Walker. When she married, it was Vin who walked her down the aisle every Father's Day. She calls him "my second dad." Online, she signs her messages with the same initials, MW plus VF, Meadow Walker and Vin's family. It's not for publicity, it's for legacy, a living bridge between two lives forever intertwined. Vin once said, "When people ask me about legacy, I don't think about awards. I think about what Paul taught me, to live for others." And maybe that's why, even after 10 films, Fast and Furious never wrote Dominic Toretto saying goodbye. Because for Vin Diesel, family doesn't end with death. It simply shifts from flesh to memory. Every November, the world keeps moving. But somewhere on set, a man sits beside an empty chair, looking at it for a long time, as if waiting for his brother to return. Then he whispers, "For Paul." The engines start again, roaring into the night, carrying two names instead of one. Fame doesn't just build empires, it tests them. After 2 decades of steering one of Hollywood's biggest franchises, whispers began to swirl around Vin Diesel's world. Not about the movies, but about the man behind them. The first tremor came in 2016. On the set of The Fate of the Furious, tension simmered between Vin Diesel and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. The chemistry that electrified the screen had turned cold off it. The Rock posted a cryptic message online, calling some of his male co-stars candy asses. He never named names, he didn't have to. Hollywood knew who he meant. Production pressed on, but the air on set grew heavier. Scenes were rewritten. Shooting schedules separated them. By 2018, Dwayne walked away, launching Hobbs and Shaw, a spin-off that marked the quiet fracture of the franchise's brotherhood. The tabloids called it a war of egos. Vin never fired back. He simply kept working, choosing silence over spectacle. Then, in 22, another storm hit. 5 days into filming Fast X, longtime director Justin Lin abruptly resigned. The official statement spoke of creative differences, but insiders described something messier: long nights, last-minute rewrites, and Vin's habit of changing scenes on instinct. Crew members jokingly called it Dom's Law. When Vin changed the plan, everyone adapted. Universal reportedly lost millions during the production halt, and critics began asking what fans never wanted to. Had the franchise's greatest strength become its heaviest burden? But the roughest headline came the following year. In 2023, a former assistant filed a civil lawsuit in Atlanta, alleging misconduct dating back to the Fast Five era. Vin's legal team called the accusations false, and 4 of the 6 claims were quickly dismissed in court. 2 more remained under review. Through it all, Vin said nothing publicly, no interviews, no statements, no defense in headlines. Only his lawyer spoke, and his work continued. An executive once said, "He's a fortress, but even fortresses crack when the storms don't stop." And yet, through scandal, exhaustion, and endless scrutiny, Vin Diesel did what he always had. He kept showing up, letting silence speak louder than the noise. Long before the gossip columns and courtrooms, Vin Diesel faced a different kind of crisis, one that tested not his fame, but his faith in people. In 2013, while producing Riddick, the project that meant the most to him, the film suddenly ran out of money halfway through production. Studios pulled their funding, crews went unpaid, and the entire shoot was days away from collapse. Most actors would have walked away. Vin didn't. Instead, he did something unthinkable. He mortgaged his own Los Angeles home, worth $4.7 million, and personally wired more than $3 million of his own money to cover salaries, meals, and visual effects so the crew could finish what they started. Director David Twohy later said, "He didn't have to do it, but he did. That's who he is." To Vin, it wasn't about saving a movie, it was about keeping his word. No one was left behind, not on his watch. When Riddick finally hit theaters, the box office numbers were modest, and the profits couldn't repay what he had risked. But he never complained, never blamed anyone. He only said one sentence that summed up everything he'd learned. Sometimes you pay the price for believing too much. It wasn't just money he gambled, it was trust. And though it cost him dearly, it also defined him as something rarer than a star, a man who keeps his promises, even when it hurts. For years, Vin Diesel built his image on invincibility, the man who leaped from cars, sprinted through explosions, and took hits that would drop most stuntmen. But behind the camera, that strength was slowly tearing him apart. Decades of punishing action scenes left their mark. His shoulders tore tendons, his wrists strained, and the cartilage in his knees cracked like worn asphalt. He refused stunt doubles for most of his career, not out of pride, but out of honesty. "If my character takes the hit," he once said, "then I should feel it." By the height of the Fast and Furious era, he weighed nearly 270 pounds, a tower of controlled muscle, built to endure anything Hollywood demanded. But the same armor that made him unstoppable was quietly turning against him. Doctors warned him that within 10 years, he could lose his mobility entirely if he didn't slow down. They called it wear and tear. He called it the bill for every moment of glory. There were mornings when he couldn't raise his arm to shut off the light, nights when every breath came with a reminder of old battles. Still, before sunrise, he'd limp onto set, tape his wrists, and smile for the camera as if nothing hurt. Because for Vin Diesel, pain wasn't a weakness. It was the tax he paid for being real in a world built on make-believe. By 2022, the man who had spent his life chasing power finally decided to make peace with his own body. The clang of iron weights and the roar of gym speakers faded into quiet mornings. He stopped training for war and started training for forgiveness, of time, of pain, of himself. He gave up what he once called ego lifting. No more proving strength through strain. Instead came yoga mats, deep breaths, and stillness. He traded adrenaline for awareness. His diet turned clean, lean fish, greens, water, and silence. No more red meat, no alcohol, no need to numb what he had survived. The transformation wasn't for the cameras, it was for the man in the mirror, the one who had spent decades carrying muscle like armor. Now he learned that real strength doesn't come from resistance, but from release. My power isn't in my arms anymore, he said quietly. It's in my patience. These days, his mornings are slower, his movements deliberate, each breath a reminder that even engines need rest. And for the first time in his life, Vin Diesel's greatest role isn't about speed or survival, it's about healing. Today, Vin Diesel's life looks nothing like the cracked walls of his childhood in New York. From those cold nights in West Beth to the sun-drenched hills of Beverly Hills, his journey has come full circle. His estimated net worth now exceeds $225 million. The reward of decades spent building more than movies, building an empire on grit, loyalty, and resilience. His main home, a $5.2 million sanctuary in Beverly Hills, isn't a mansion built for show. It's quiet, white stone and glass, filled with light instead of luxury. There's a private gym where morning sunlight drifts across iron and yoga mats alike, a small garden where he writes in a leather journal barefoot, and a home theater that plays both Fast and Furious premieres and Disney movies with his children. But the place that speaks the loudest isn't the house, it's the garage. Vin calls it a cathedral of motion. Inside rests a 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, the same model Dominic Toretto drove, rebuilt, revered, and preserved. Beside it, a 1970 Charger RT, custom built with a 9-liter V8 engine pushing 1,650 horsepower, a Thunderstorm forged in steel. There's also the Lykan Hypersport, one of only 7 in existence, worth nearly $4 million, its headlights inlaid with diamonds. And in the corner, parked quietly, a 1994 Toyota Supra identical to Paul Walker's from Fast and Furious. It isn't a trophy, it's a memory, a way to keep a brother's spirit idling just a few feet away. For all his success, Vin rarely speaks of money. He measures wealth in the laughter that fills his kitchen, in birthdays spent at home, in the silence of nights when his children are safe and sleeping. Outside the spotlight, he gives quietly. Through his foundation, he funds youth education, disaster relief, and programs for military families. After Paul Walker's passing, he continued Paul's legacy, donating to Reach Out worldwide and supporting communities hit by crisis, always without headlines. You don't measure a man by what he earns, he once said. You measure him by what he gives back after the world stops watching. And that is Vin Diesel's greatest wealth. Not the cars, not the mansion, not the fame, but the family he built and the lives he chose to lift along the way.